Welcome to the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Pompeo's nod for Israel's bid to counter Russian-backed Iranian forces in Syria. Trump slows U.S. exit from Syria as U.S. military shifts from Syria to Iraq. Israel warns that the U.S. exiting Syria will cause Iranian aggression. Funeral for the 10 victims of a flash flood in southern Israel as the academy head is detained. Iran manipulates Iraq's elections for U.S. ouster. Trump's Middle East peace plan to be unveiled during the U.S. embassy move. And now to our top headlines. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met yesterday in Tel Aviv to discuss the Iranian threat. Meanwhile, a Russian-backed Syrian force moved across the Euphrates and captured U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces Kurdish villages. This provides Iran with a way to move towards the Iraqi border. Pompeo said at the meeting that the U.S. is committed to halting the full range of Iranian influence in Syria, including Iran's missile systems, its support for Hezbollah, and its importation of thousands of Shiite fighters into Syria. He said, quote, "We strongly support Israel's sovereign right to defend itself."
Strong cooperation with close allies like you is critical to our efforts to counter Iran's destabilizing and malign activity throughout the Middle East, and indeed throughout the world. We remain deeply concerned about Iran's dangerous escalation of threats to Israel and the region, and Iran's ambition to dominate the Middle East remains.
Debka military sources report that the Syrian push into the U.S.-held region will let the Trump administration know that while they were preparing to remove U.S. troops from Syria, Moscow was increasing its support for Iran to move in and expand in the country. Several hours after a Russian-backed Syrian force captured a string of U.S.-backed Kurdish villages east of the Euphrates on Sunday, Kurdish forces mounted a counteroffensive to push them back with a U.S. air support. Meanwhile, a string of missile attacks last night against pro-Iranian Shiite targets in Syria were reported this morning by Syrian and Lebanese media. Some reports claim there are 40 dead, including 18 children. Hezbollah's newspaper, Al-Akhbar, has accused Israel. However, Syrian rebels have taken responsibility for the attack. According to Syrian sources, 2 pro-Iranian militia command posts were targeted. Netanyahu commented about Iran's increasing influence and how Israel and the U.S. plan to remedy the escalating threat.
If people thought that Iran's aggression would be moderated as a result of signing the deal, the opposite has happened. And Iran is trying to gobble up one country after the other. Iran must be stopped. Its quest for nuclear bombs must be stopped. Its aggression must be stopped. And we're committed to stopping it together.
On Thursday, Defense Secretary James Mattis discussed with Congress the plan to remove U.S. troops from Syria. He told the Armed Force Committee that he believes a military confrontation between Israel and Iran in Syria is becoming more likely, and accused Iran of expanding its presence in Syria by bringing advanced weaponry for Hezbollah.
Right now, Senator, we are not withdrawing. You'll see a re-energized effort against the Middle Euphrates River Valley in the days ahead, and against the rest of the caliphate, the geographic caliphate. You'll see increased operations on the Iraq side of the border, and the French have just reinforced us in Syria with special forces here in the last 2 weeks, and this is an ongoing fight right now.
On Friday, Pentagon officials stated that U.S. satellites, surveillance aircraft, drones, and ships had stepped up operations to monitor the movement of suspected Iranian ballistic missiles inside Syria due to rising concerns that they could be used to strike Israel in the coming days. U.S. President Trump will continue his goal of pulling U.S. troops out of Syria, but will do it in several stages. According to Debka military sources, the exit will be at the discretion of his top advisors and could be halted or canceled at any time. Trump discussed this strategy with Emmanuel Macron during his visit to Washington last week and made a compromise with the French president, who's been pleading with Trump to not pull U.S. troops out of Syria. Trump decided to compromise with Macron and Merkel as he suspects Russian President Vladimir Putin is preparing to take advantage of the U.S. departure from Syria. Trump is concerned that Iran will use this as an outbreak of violence in order to take control of the country. Trump sent General Joseph Votel, head of the U.S. Central Command, to Israel to make a case for the U.S. withdrawal from Syria. He spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, and Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot. Debka sources report that the plan that General Votel presented to them was the following. 1,200 out of 2,000 U.S. troops will be withdrawn from Syria. Half of the remaining 800 troops will be sent to the Remlin Air Base in the Kurdish region of northeastern Syria to monitor the Syrian-Iraqi border. They will be given a helicopter force for sudden attacks east of the Euphrates River. The other half will stay at Al-Tanf, where U.S. troops will look for hostile military movements in Daraa and Kenitra. Although the troops will remain in Remlin indefinitely, the Al-Tanf location could be evacuated if the Trump administration comes to an agreement with Moscow over the next few weeks. Washington is looking for a guarantee against Syrian, Iranian, Hezbollah, and other Shiite militias setting up bases near Jordanian and Israeli borders. If Trump receives this guarantee, he will order the evacuation of U.S. troops from Al-Tanf. Meanwhile, the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier will be used as backup for the remaining troops still in place. U.S. intelligence advised the president that the pro-U.S. Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurdish YPG militia are equipped to defend themselves and can manage without U.S. military forces. Trump is now looking for a deal with Moscow. There are several obstacles that could prevent this potential deal from taking place. Trump is held back by the outrage in Washington over Putin's meddling in the U.S. election. Putin's also being held responsible for the toxic nerve agent attack on the former British spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Furthermore, the Russian Defense Ministry believes that since the U.S. will have to withdraw from Syria anyway, they should not receive concessions. Although Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is in favor of getting Washington involved, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is against it. Meanwhile, Israel has gone to great lengths to persuade the White House that U.S. troops should remain in Syria. Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman traveled to Washington on April 24th to convince Trump not to pull U.S. troops out of the country. His trip was necessary as the U.S. had previously declined to discuss the U.S. exit plan's impact on Israel's security. Lieberman's goal was to explain to the U.S. that as soon as U.S. troops leave Syria, Israel will be threatened by Iran and Hezbollah. He warned Trump that if Iran attacks Tel Aviv, Israel will, quote, strike at Tehran and demolish every Iranian military site in Syria that threatens our country. The defense minister tried to convince the new national security advisor, John Bolton, and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis of the dangers posed by Iran as soon as the Americans were gone from Syria. Mattis expects that the efforts against the Islamic State in Syria will continue. Prior to Lieberman's meeting with Bolton and Mattis, Joseph Votel visited Israel to present the Trump administration's case for exiting Syria. However, he had the opposite result than what was intended. Israel is concerned about the U.S. withdrawal for a number of reasons. First, Russia accelerated its advanced arms shipments to Syria by sea using the U.S., British, French strike on Bashar Assad's chemical facilities on April 13th as the basis for updating the Syrian army's arsenal. Moscow knows the new weaponry, including the S-300 air defense systems, is a threat to Israel, but their primary concern is strengthening the Syrian army to assist the Assad regime against all future attacks. As the S-300's capabilities pose a challenge to the Israeli Air Force, Lieberman warned that if the new air defense system goes into action against Israeli Air Force jets, it will be destroyed. The Western strike in Syria also caused Iran to open an air corridor to deliver arms to Syria and Hezbollah. The relationship between Netanyahu and Putin has been on a decline since Putin put restraints on Israeli Air Force and military activities in Syria. Israel is skeptical about the cooperation of French, Egyptian, and Saudi Arabian forces in Syria. Meanwhile, President Trump is considering giving Iran concessions in his pursuit with the Europeans in order to enable him to recertify the nuclear deal on May 12th. The White House has agreed to decrease its demands for Iran to get rid of the ballistic missile program. They're agreeing only on the long-range missiles that could reach America. 10 students were killed on Thursday when a flash flood in stormy weather overpowered the Zafit River in southern Israel near the Dead Sea. All the victims were 17 to 19-year-old students at a pre-military academy. The head of the seminary and the teacher who organized the desert hike during the flash flood warning have been detained for interrogation on suspicion of negligent homicide. Israeli police spokesman Mickey Rosenfeld had these comments amidst a massive search and rescue operation before the full impact of the disaster was known.
Israeli National Police rescue units responded to flash floods that took place in the southern part of Israel, in the southern area of the Dead Sea. What we know is there were more than 25 students in an area where there were flash floods that were hit. What we confirmed until now is there are a number of people that have been killed within that group and more than 10 other students that are missing. Our main emphasis at the moment is to try and find those missing people in order to try and get them to hospital as quick as possible and give them medical attention. The rescue efforts are continuing right now.
Prime Minister Netanyahu issued a statement saying, quote, "All of Israel laments in the terrible tragedy that cut short the lives of 10 young, wonderful people who had such promising futures." One of the victims had written a text message prior to going out on the trail that stated, quote, "I can't believe that I'm actually going out in this weather. It's not logical that we should go to such a place where there will be floods. It's tempting fate. We will die. I'm serious." This was the deadliest incident in recent years caused by harsh storms, which caused the riverbeds to expand into torrents. Flash floods are common in Israel following heavy rains as surges of water run through the narrow channels into the Dead Sea and the region that runs along the Negev desert. With us in the studio is Brigadier General Hamish, former head of the Israeli Air Force Intelligence and chairman of HaShomer HaChadash. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So let's go back to Iran. Can you discuss the rising tension following the attacks on pro-Iranian Shiite positions in Syria?
Even though I don't know who attacked in Syria, but we see kind of a process of Iranian attempt to smuggle a weapon, a very strategic weapon, to Syria. And our defense minister said ahead of time that we are not going to tolerate with such an advance of weapon inside Syria. So something happened last night and destroyed of a lot of weapons and even people that have killed in this attack. It's a sign that the tension is getting higher and higher between Iran and Israel, whether Israel attack or other country attack. I can't anticipate that in the next 10 days, because there is the nuclear deal, there will not be a retaliation. But I take the Iranian very seriously. I advise ourselves, the Air Force and the IDF, to be very cautious in the next couple of weeks, on one hand, but to be very aggressive on any kind of continuous smuggling of weapons to Syria by the Iranian regime. It's a very dangerous situation in the area.
Can you provide more background on the situation and how was Iran able to get away with this?
What happened in the last couple of weeks, there is kind of many airplanes with ammunition that are landing in Syria, very upfront, and of course they always do a lot of attempt to have a land trucks that are going from Iran through Iraq and to Syria, and of course to Lebanon. And this kind of attempt by the Iranian, it's not an exception. It's happened in the south in Yemen, which is, we don't have any connection with Yemen. It's happened in Syria, and it's happened even in the political activities like influencing the election in Iraq and influencing the election in Lebanon. And everything is like a kind of a bridge between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon against Israel and against any kind of American interest in the region. It's a very tense situation nowadays in the Middle East.
The Israeli cabinet is holding a meeting in regards to the next steps. Can you discuss what these might be?
I can't discuss because I'm not there, but I can give my advice. And my advice is to be very cautious and very serious with those threats by the Iranian regime. Yes, they are going to wait, hopefully, or maybe up to the 12th of May, because this is what's important for them now, the nuclear deal. Nevertheless, they will not give up. So my advice is, one hand, to be very modest and not to speak a lot, only to be prepared to any kind of retaliation on one hand, but to be very active preventing those smuggling weapons on the other hand.
Moving to the flood, how do you think the situation could impact future students who want to volunteer for a pre-military academy in Israel?
There was a terrible tragedy in Israel last week. We lost our best youth in this kind of flood. It's caught us by surprise. Just to explain the audience, what does it mean mechinot or pre-military service? In Israel, it's a new innovation. It is not happening in any other place in the world. We have it started 30 years ago, and today we have more than 40 academy of pre-military. Before they serve in the army, they volunteer for 1 year pre-military service where they prepare themselves, they deepen the studying of Judaism and Zionism, Jewish identity, and of course volunteering in the community. And those youth, those are the best we have. Every year we have 35,000 youth, and one of the things that they do daily, almost daily, they walk and hike Israel from north to south, from east to west, because they want to feel the country. They want to feel the connection between us and our land, the Holy Land of Israel. Nevertheless, the tragedy caught us by surprise, maybe poor planning, and we lost the best youth that we have in Israel. And those youth find this flood. They try to climb on the walls of the river. Some of them that were strong enough to hold the rocks survive, and some of them were too weak and they couldn't survive. It's a real tragedy. It's a national tragedy. And in Israel now we are under debriefing, and I, as myself, I'm heading one of these pre-military 1 year service. We have to think once again, we have to think how we can do it better, how we can give this inspiration of youth that are coming to serve the country an extra to the military, but this aspiration and this youth, we have to give them the capability to serve the country, but to do it safe. This is our obligation as adults, to do it safe, but to give them the opportunity to go all over Israel, from south to west, and to know the connection between the Israeli people to the Holy Land.
That's Morelli. Thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you.
As President Trump is fighting to get U.S. troops out of Syria, Tehran is putting together a plan for pushing the U.S. military out of Iraq. Debka sources report that Ali Shamkhani, head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, is preparing for a victory for the Popular Mobilization units at the general elections. Al-Ameri, former Iraqi transportation minister, is the Revolutionary Guard's favorite of all the Shiite party leaders. The Shiite makes up 65% of Iraq's population. Al-Ameri's Conquest Alliance has rivals in the Shiite stakes. There's the Victory Coalition, headed by the outgoing Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi, the Rule of Law Alliance, led by former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, and the alliance formed by Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's party with the secular Iraqi Communist Party. If Tehran's favorite, the Conquest Alliance, does not receive a majority, Al-Ameri will form a coalition with Sadr's Marching Towards Reform Party. They will have a shared goal of getting the U.S. out of Iraq. Up to 9,000 U.S. military personnel are stationed in Iraq, including Habanya near Baghdad, al-Assad in Anbar, and a third base in the Shiite-dominated southern region. U.S. President Trump has ordered senior advisor Jared Kushner and Special Representative for International Negotiations Jason Greenblatt to finalize the Middle East peace plan. The document must be completed 2 weeks before the inauguration of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin will lead the U.S. official delegation to the event, along with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who arrived in Israel yesterday. The peace plan will be revealed at the same time as the U.S. Embassy inauguration on May 14th. The plan will be released regardless of its rejection by Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas and the entire Palestinian leadership. The summary of the plan, as revealed exclusively by Debka, is that a Palestinian state will be established with limited sovereignty across half the West Bank and all of the Gaza Strip. Israel will retain security responsibility for most of the West Bank and border crossings. They will also retain a military presence in the Jordan Valley. The Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem will be part of the Palestinian state, except for the Old City. Palestine and Jordan will share religious jurisdiction over the city's mosques. The proposed capital of Palestine will be Abu Dis. Gaza will be integrated into the new state if Hamas agrees to be disarmed. Israel will be recognized as the homeland of the Jewish people, and Palestine, with limited sovereignty, as the Palestinian homeland. And now for a roundup of this week's regional stories, the news in brief. A letter written by the German composer Richard Wagner that brought to light his anti-Semitic views was just sold for $34,000 to a Jewish collector from Switzerland at an auction. The letter was written in 1869 and attempts to explain the ideas in Wagner's anti-Semitic essay called Judaism in Music. In the letter, Wagner wrote that the French were unable to understand, quote, the destructive influence of the Jewish spirit on modern culture. Wagner was the chosen composer of Adolf Hitler. An online radio show in Egypt offers legal advice and awareness about rights for divorced women. Launched by Mahasen Saber, the show challenges the social stigmas associated with divorce and provides psychological assistance. Saber hosts the shows from her local internet cafe. A UN study in 2013 shows that half of all divorced or separated women in Egypt have reported domestic abuse. Divorce rates are escalating in the country, with a recent 10% increase in the number of registered cases. Jordanian audiences enjoyed an eclectic variety of jazz performances at the 7th annual Amman Jazz Festival this past weekend. The three-day event brought together musicians from all parts of the world, including Sweden and Germany, for a weekend of cultural diversity. The festival is sponsored by the European Union, the European Union National Institutes for Culture, and several European embassies in Amman. That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.